For me personally, I love a good mystery. In fact, I was raised reading the Nancy Drew series and always dreamed about becoming an amateur detective like her. Clearly, that didn't work out for me, but I'm fine with that. But I'm also kinda glad, because real life cases are not as glamorous as the teen sleuth makes it out to be. Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Most Amazing Top 10. I'm your host Lindsay Ivan, and today I will be sharing with you 10 scary real detective stories. Now, let me just state that for some of these cases, the detectives refuse to state their own name or even have changed their names in the case in order to maintain privacy. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's just dive on into the video. Starting off at number 10, we have the case of mistaken identity. This story was told by a man whose mother was a detective. Apparently, she told him about a case of an old man who wanted to reunite with his daughter. He was reading the paper when he saw it contained a picture of his daughter. He then hired a private investigator who successfully tracks her down, and DNA tests conclude that she is in fact his daughter. Except this is when it gets creepy. Now, this man hadn't seen his daughter in a year because she had supposedly passed away from leukemia. She had medical records and everything saying that she passed. When they dug up her supposed grave since she was alive, it was a man who passed away from a heart attack. This case still remains a mystery as there is no record of the doctor who treated his daughter or why the man was buried in her grave. Did the doctor fake the records to get away with murder? Who knows? At number 9, we have the case of the locked door. This next man, by the name of Rob McGinley, was a co-lead detective for a possible murder case. While exploring the house where the murder took place, they found that the house was locked with a deadbolt latched. After trying the door multiple times, they decided to wait on some entry tools. That's when the door appeared to have opened by itself with the deadbolt now off. They scouted the inside of the house, but no one appeared to be home, so they headed back on out. Then they found that the door had been locked again and the deadbolt was put back on. This happened one last time when the door opened again. They searched the entire house again, but just as before, it was still empty. They believed that the ghost of the boy who passed away was then playing tricks on them. Now, I don't even know what to say about this. It's definitely creepy and weird. Moving on to number 8, we have the boy on the bench. This next story is from a man named Buddy Smith, who was a security guard that worked with multiple detectives. Apparently one day he saw a 9-year-old boy with a striped shirt sitting on a bench in the med center that he worked at. When he looked back, the boy was gone without a trace. Now, he worked alongside 8 detectives and most of them have also seen this boy in the striped shirt. They also reported seeing coffee pots being knocked over and hearing loud footsteps while being alone. They believe that the cemetery across the street from their place attributed to these ghostly occurrences. At number 7, we have the case of Steven Tyler. Yes, you heard that correctly. Reddit user Mr. Macaroni posted this next story that his police detective friend told him. So his detective friend was investigating the death of a young woman. It was believed that she took her own life, but detectives thought that she had been manipulated into doing it. Now, why did they think this? Well, she was found with multiple letters that were said to have been from none other than Steven Tyler from Aerosmith. Apparently, she was convinced that they had been exchanging letters and were dating. In one of these letters, Steven writes saying that he was breaking up with her, and that is said what caused her to take her life. After investigating, detectives found letters that she wrote to Steven and that he sent to her. But both of these letters were addressed to her house, meaning that she was writing letters to herself as Steven, and she would reply to them with no recollection that she initially wrote them. She was so convinced that she was in a relationship with Steven that she ended up being the own cause of her death. For our 6th spot, we have the mystery murder. This next detective shares another case that is still unexplained. Several years ago, this detective arrives to the scene of a crime, an apartment, to find that it is completely empty. Its only contents were a few personal items, and then the body of the deceased. It is said that he was a young male, 25 to 30s in age, who appeared to be in good shape. There were no signs of struggle, only a small blood splatter on the wall behind him. This is when it starts to get strange. The detective states that the guy had no injuries, just a small round hole at the back of his head, but there was no bleeding at all. After interviewing the neighbors, it was said that there was no unusual activity or noise during the previous nights. The case was never solved. No one knows how he got the hole at the back of the neck or what caused it or how he passed away. Truly eerie. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark. This next story was apparently one told by many students by their religion teacher, who was a retired detective. It was said that when he was a detective, he was called into a scene at an abandoned church. When he arrived, he found that the church was covered in blood. From the walls to the ceilings to the floor, it was coated in blood. Yeah, that's definitely not for the faint of heart. Whew. With the amount of blood present, they believe that it must have come from 6 or 7 people. However, no bodies were ever found. They eventually drew the conclusion that it was sacrifices made from a cult that they were tracking down, but this still remains a huge mystery. Moving on to number 4, we have the ICEBOX murders. This crime took place on June 20th in 1965, which happened to be on Father's Day, making the story even more sad. Homicide detective James Paul Kay was the lead detective on this case, and he described what he witnessed when he arrived at the scene, which happened to be the home of an elderly couple, Fred and Edwina Rogers. The officers state that on all the shelves and in the freezer compartment were the dismembered bodies cut and wrapped up like meat packages, and in the fridge drawers they found the heads of Mr. and Miss Rogers. Although the case was never solved, Detective Paul was determined to find answers. He believes that the crime was committed by the couple's own son, Charles Rogers, but it was never proven. It was a very violent crime to witness, and apparently whoever did the crime was fairly intelligent. In our third spot, we have the case of the hotel murder. This next case comes from the perspective of a homicide detective. He was sent to investigate a case where a real estate man was found dead in his hotel room by the maid. When he arrived to the scene, he found that the room was in complete disarray. This businessman's body was found in the middle of the room, face up. His body was also completely disfigured. He claims that most of the victim's bones, like his legs and ribs, were crushed to dust, and he suffered from internal bleeding. As a result, he thought that it was a murder done out of hatred. What made this detective even more uneasy was how there was no suspect or weapon. He checked the hotel's cameras for clues, but no one was seen entering or leaving his room. Coming in at number 2, we have the panic room killer. Again, this same detective shared another story that still haunts him, and rightfully so. For this case, this detective was called into a scene where the victim had called 911 after saying he was hiding in his panic room from someone who wanted to kill him. He refers to this victim as Richard. When they arrived at his house, there were no signs of forced entry, and all the doors remained locked from the inside. Inside the house, there was no damage and it was super clean. No signs of violence or anything. Due to this, the detective believed that the attacker was someone that Richard knew and invited inside. When they eventually got to the panic room, they found Richard inside, and this is when the detective got very uneasy. Richard was sitting on the floor, his face with a terrified expression plastered on it. Both of his arms were missing, not cut off, they looked as if they had been ripped off. His missing limbs were never found. Now, as soon as they reported these findings, the police captain told the team to give all the evidence along with the victim's body to the individuals in a blue van that arrived on scene. They did as they were told, and since then the case has been buried. Wow, who are these men in the blue van? Was Richard attacked by some sort of creature and they were trying to cover it up? I don't know, let me know what you think in the comments below. And in our number 1 spot, we have the silent killer. Now, this story comes from the same homicide detective as mentioned above. Now, this was his second case ever and happened around 10 years ago. He claims that this case in particular gives him ongoing nightmares and is the scariest case that he has worked on. Now, he got a call to investigate a woman named Simone who a neighbor was worried about. Apparently, she hadn't been seen for days, but every day at night, a man would be seen entering her house. Well, when he arrived at the scene, he was horrified. The kitchen was covered in blood from the ceiling to the floors. Test results showed that it was Simone's blood, but her body was never found. They had no leads to who would have done this, except for the mystery man who the neighbor had seen entering the house. They ended up catching the man by waiting outside Simone's house until he showed. Now, onto the scarier part. This man was taken into custody and would not eat or drink anything, but he would just sit there smirking the whole time. He eventually passed away from what they thought was dehydration, but they were wrong. An autopsy revealed that he was completely healthy, as if being fed every day. The only thing in his stomach was a piece of tissue. That belonged to Simone. Turns out every night this man would go to her house and eat, well, I don't even want to say it, but But in the fridge, it turns out there were bags of what they thought were meat, but were actually her body. And that's all for today's video. As always, don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up, comment down below something interesting for me to read, and don't forget to subscribe to Most Amazing Top 10 for more amazing videos.